There are moments in life when everything looks normal on the outside, yet inside, something feels deeply unsettled. You pray, you try to believe. You tell yourself, God is with me. But the silence feels heavy, and the questions won't go away. Why does God feel distant right now? Why am I still struggling if I'm trying to follow him? Is this silence a sign that I've failed or that God has turned away? If you've ever asked questions like these, you are not weak, you are not broken, and you are certainly not alone. Throughout the Bible, some of the most faithful people, David, Job, Elijah, even the disciples, walked through seasons where God seemed quiet, not absent, not uncaring, but silent. And that silence was never meaningless. In fact, Scripture reveals something unexpected. God often does his deepest work when we hear him the least. This video is not here to offer shallow comfort or quick answers. It is here to help you understand what God may be doing behind the silence, why he sometimes withdraws his voice, how this silence shapes faith, and what it means for your life right now. By the end of this message, you may not have every question answered, but you may discover something far more important, that God's silence is not rejection, it is often preparation. Let us begin by looking at the first truth the Bible teaches about divine silence, and why it happens more often than we expect. Part 1. When God is silent, he is not absent. One of the greatest misunderstandings about God's silence is the assumption that silence means absence. We are used to measuring presence by sound. If someone speaks to us, we feel acknowledged. If they stop speaking, we assume they have left. But Scripture shows us a different reality. In the book of Job, God remains silent for chapter after chapter while Job suffers intensely. Job cries out, questions God, defends his integrity, and even accuses God of injustice. Yet during all that time, God is not gone. He is listening. He is observing. He is allowing a process to unfold that Job cannot yet see. God's silence is often intentional, not neglectful. Psalm 46 says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Notice it does not say God is a loud help. It says he is a present help. Presence does not always speak. Sometimes presence watches. Sometimes presence waits. There are seasons when God chooses silence because words would interfere with growth. Just as a teacher stays quiet during an exam, not because they don't care, but because the test reveals what the student has truly learned. In those moments, God is not punishing you. He is trusting you. Another example comes from the life of Jesus. Before he began his public ministry, the Gospels describe a long period of silence, nearly 30 years. No miracles, no sermons. No recorded divine voice from heaven. Yet those silent years were not wasted years. They were years of preparation, obedience, and hidden faithfulness. If the Son of God himself lived through extended silence before stepping into purpose, why would we expect our own journey to be different? When God is silent, he is often doing one of two things, either strengthening what you already believe or revealing what you rely on more than him. Silence exposes foundations. When there is no clear answer, no emotional reassurance, no immediate relief, what remains is what your faith is truly built on. This is uncomfortable. This is unsettling. And yet this is where faith matures. The silence of God does not mean he has stepped back. It often means he is standing closer than ever, watching to see whether you will trust his character even when you cannot hear his voice. Part 2. Silence reveals the difference between faith and dependence. There is a subtle but important difference between faith in God and dependence on his answers. Faith says, I trust who you are. Dependence on answers says, I trust you as long as you explain yourself. God's silence often exposes which one we are living by. In the Gospel of John, Jesus performs miracles that draw large crowds. People follow him, listen to him, and call him Lord. But when he stops performing signs and begins speaking difficult truths, Many of them walk away. John records this moment with painful honesty. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. The problem was not that Jesus changed. The problem was that the people realized they were more attached to what he gave than to who he was. Silence does the same thing. When prayers go unanswered, when direction feels unclear, when emotional reassurance fades, our relationship with God is tested at its core. Do we trust God only when he explains? Or do we trust him because he is God? This is not cruelty. This is refinement. Just as gold is tested by fire, faith is tested by silence. In the Old Testament, Abraham receives a promise from God, a son through whom an entire nation would come. Then God goes silent for years. Decades pass. No updates, no clarification, no timeline. Yet Scripture says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Faith matured not through constant reassurance, but through waiting. Silence stretches faith beyond emotion and into conviction. Many believers confuse the feeling of God's presence with the reality of God's faithfulness, but feelings fluctuate. God's character does not. When God is silent, he is inviting you to move from emotional dependence to relational trust, from needing constant confirmation to resting in covenant. This is why silence feels threatening at first. It removes control. It removes certainty. It removes the illusion that we understand what God is doing, but it also removes shallow faith. God is not interested in creating followers who need constant signs. He is forming sons and daughters who trust him even when the path is unclear. If you are in a season where God feels quiet, it may not be because you are drifting away from him. It may be because he is drawing you deeper, beyond answers, beyond feelings, and into true faith. Part 3, God's silence is often preparation, not delay. One of the hardest things to accept in the spiritual life is that timing matters just as much as intention. We may be ready emotionally. We may be desperate spiritually, but that does not always mean we are ready structurally for what God intends to give. This is where silence becomes preparation. Throughout Scripture, God consistently works in hidden seasons before public fulfillment. Moses spends 40 years in the wilderness before leading Israel. David is anointed king, then returns to obscurity while Saul remains on the throne. Joseph receives dreams of authority, then spends years in prison and exile. In each case, there is a long gap between promise and fulfillment, and God says almost nothing during that gap. Why? Because calling without formation destroys people. If God explained everything too early, if he revealed every step in advance, we might arrive at the destination without the character required to remain there. Silence develops internal strength. In the wilderness, Moses learns humility. In hiding, David learns restraint. In prison, Joseph learns discernment and forgiveness. None of these lessons come quickly, and none of them are learned through explanation. God does not waste silence. He uses it to build capacity. Capacity to lead without pride. Capacity to obey without applause. Capacity to trust without understanding. This is why God sometimes refuses to answer the question when. Because the real issue is not time, it is readiness. If God gave you everything you are asking for right now, would it deepen your faith or replace it? Would it draw you closer or make you self-sufficient? Silence is not God ignoring your prayers. It is God shaping you into someone who can steward the answer. When you feel forgotten, God may be fortifying you. When nothing seems to be happening, something is being formed. This season may feel empty, but it is not passive. It is active preparation. Part 4. When God is silent in suffering, perhaps the most painful form of God's silence is not confusion, but suffering. It is one thing when God is quiet while we are waiting. It is another when he is quiet while we are hurting. This is where faith feels most fragile. In moments of loss, injustice, illness, or deep emotional pain, silence can feel like abandonment. We cry out not for explanation but for relief, and when none comes, we begin to wonder if God sees us at all. The Bible does not avoid this tension. On the cross, Jesus himself cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is not a lack of faith. It is the language of honest suffering. Yet even here, God is not absent. The silence of God during Jesus' suffering was not indifference. It was purpose unfolding. Redemption was being accomplished in a way that could not be interrupted, rushed, or softened. Sometimes, God remains silent not because he does not care, but because what he is doing cannot be undone. In the book of Lamentations, written in the aftermath of Jerusalem's destruction, the writer says, "It is good that one should hope and wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." This is not passive resignation. It is painful trust. Suffering strips away illusions. It removes the false belief that faith protects us from pain. Instead, Scripture reveals that faith often carries us through pain, not around it. God's silence in suffering does not mean he approves of the pain. It means he is present within it. Psalm 23 does not say, "You will avoid the valley of the shadow of death." It says, "You will walk through it and I will be with you." Silence in suffering forces a deeper question. Will we trust God's heart when we cannot trace his hand? This kind of trust is not learned in comfort. It is forged in darkness. And remarkably, Scripture tells us that God is closest to the brokenhearted, not the strong, not the confident, but the wounded. If you are suffering and God feels quiet, you are not being punished. You are not being ignored. You are being held in a way that words cannot explain. Part 5. How to live faithfully when God is silent. When God is silent, the most important question is not why he is silent, but how we respond to that silence. Scripture does not encourage us to panic, withdraw, or abandon faith when God grows quiet. Instead, it shows us a pattern, clear, demanding, and deeply transformative. The first response is faithful obedience. In the book of Habakkuk, the prophet questions God about injustice and suffering. God responds briefly and then becomes silent again. Habakkuk does not receive detailed explanations or timelines. Yet his final response is powerful. "Though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vine, yet I will rejoice in the Lord." Obedience in silence is one of the highest expressions of faith. When God is silent, obedience proves that your faith is rooted in truth, not reward. You continue to pray, serve, forgive, and walk upright, not because you feel God, but because you know him. The second response is stillness. Psalm 46 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness is not inactivity, it is restraint. In silence, we are tempted to rush ahead, force outcomes, or manufacture clarity. Stillness resists that urge. It says, "I will not move until God moves." Many mistakes are born from impatience in silence. Stillness allows discernment to grow. It quiets the noise of fear, comparison, and anxiety so that when God does speak, we can recognize his voice. The third response is honest prayer. Silence does not mean we stop speaking to God. The Psalms are filled with prayers spoken into silence, raw, emotional, unfiltered. God does not require polished faith. He invites honest faith. Prayer in silence is not about getting answers. It is about staying connected. Even when God does not respond immediately, prayer keeps the relationship alive. It prevents silence from becoming distance. The fourth response is community. God often remains silent individually while speaking corporately. Throughout Scripture, guidance and encouragement frequently come through trusted people, prophets, mentors, friends, and fellow believers. Isolation amplifies silence into despair. Community anchors silence in perspective. When God feels quiet, do not withdraw. Lean into wise counsel, shared worship, and spiritual accountability. Finally, silence invites surrender. Surrender is not giving up hope. It is releasing control. Silence teaches us that God is not obligated to explain himself, yet he is always faithful. Surrender says, even if I do not understand, I will trust. This is not weakness. This is maturity. When you learn to live faithfully in silence, you discover something unexpected. Silence no longer frightens you. It becomes familiar, sacred, even intimate. Because you realize that God has been with you all along, quietly shaping, strengthening, and preparing you. Part 6. What God's silence ultimately produces. If silence were only about waiting, it would be unbearable. But Scripture reveals that silence has an outcome. God never uses silence merely to pause your life. He uses it to transform you. One of the most profound results of divine silence is spiritual depth. When God speaks constantly, faith can remain shallow, dependent on instruction, reassurance, and visible direction. But when God is silent, faith is forced to grow roots instead of branches. Roots grow in darkness. They grow unseen. They grow slowly. And they grow strong. This is why people who have walked through long seasons of silence often carry a quiet authority. They are not easily shaken. They are not desperate for validation. Their faith does not rise and fall with circumstances. Silence produces believers who know God, not just about Him. Another outcome of silence is clarity of identity. When God is speaking loudly, it is easy to confuse calling with excitement or purpose with attention. Silence removes those distractions. It strips away external affirmation and leaves one essential question. Who am I when no one is watching and God is not explaining? In Scripture, identity is always forged before assignment. Jesus is affirmed as the Son of God before performing a single miracle. David learns to be faithful as a shepherd before becoming king. Silence solidifies identity, so calling does not destroy it. God also uses silence to develop discernment. When answers are immediate, discernment is unnecessary. But in silence, you learn to distinguish between impulse and wisdom, fear and conviction, emotion and truth. You begin to recognize God's voice not by volume, but by alignment with His character. This is maturity. Silence also produces compassion. Those who have suffered through quiet seasons develop patience with others. They do not rush people through pain or offer easy answers. They understand that God's work is often slow, hidden, and deeply personal. These are the people Scripture often describes as gentle, steady, and trustworthy. Finally, silence produces unshakable trust. Not the kind of trust that depends on outcomes, but the kind that rests in who God is, regardless of what happens. This is the kind of faith that says, even if God never explains this season, I will still follow Him. And paradoxically, this is often when God begins to speak again. Not because we have waited long enough, not because we have suffered enough, but because silence has accomplished its purpose. You are no longer asking for answers to feel safe. You are anchored in God Himself. Conclusion: when silence becomes sacred, God's silence is one of the most misunderstood experiences in the life of faith. We assume silence means distance. We fear it means disapproval. We worry it means we have done something wrong. But Scripture tells a different story. Again and again, we see that God is often silent not when faith is failing, but when faith is maturing. Silence is not where God abandons His people. It is where He deepens them. In silence, shallow faith falls away. In silence, motives are purified. In silence, trust is no longer borrowed from emotion. It becomes anchored in truth. What once felt like emptiness becomes intimacy, because silence teaches us to recognize God not by constant instruction, but by character, not by immediate answers, but by enduring faithfulness. When God finally speaks after a long season of quiet, His voice does not feel foreign. It feels familiar, because silence has trained our hearts to listen differently. If you are walking through a silent season right now, let this be your reassurance. You are not forgotten. You are not ignored. You are not being tested to fail. You are being prepared to trust God at a depth that words alone could never produce. So do not rush this season. Do not numb it. Do not interpret silence as absence. Stay faithful. Stay honest. Stay rooted. Because what God is forming in you through silence will sustain you long after the noise returns. And one day, you may look back on this quiet season and realize it was not God stepping away. It was God drawing you closer than ever before.